I'm going to say here.
I'll just put your two enormous books down. Good evening, welcome everyone. How fantastic to see so many of you here. It is a complete sellout this evening. Well done, therefore, for getting your hands on such a coveted ticket, the hottest history double act in town. And it's their debut show tonight, I'm sure the first of many. My name's Hannah McInnes. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you here on behalf of the How To Academy to share the stage with these two. We can't think of two better people to take us back through this weird and wonderful tour of history, introduce us to a colourful, outlandish cast of characters, namely those who ruled over what we now call England, right through from the emperors of Rome to the medieval kings and queens. And there are queens. Women do get a bit of a look in these stories. They are, of course, characters brought to life in their books that have inspired the event. We have Unruly, A History of England's Kings and Queens, and Emperor of Rome, of course, respectively, by these two. And they will be signing them afterwards, so do stay and form a nice queue, and you'll get your book signed by David or Mary. Neither of them really need any introduction, but I'm going to introduce them, of course, anyway, just in case you've been hiding in a cupboard or something for the last 10 years. Mary is Emerita Professor and Fellow of Newnham College, Cambridge, also Classics Editor of the TLS. Her previous best-selling books before this one include Pompeii, SPQR, and Women in Power. And of course, she is a very familiar face on our TV screens, has presented many series which you'll be familiar with. As too, you will be familiar with David's many features on our TV screens in much of our best-loved comedy, Peep Show, That Mitchell and Webb Look, and Upstart Crow. This isn't your first book, but this is your first book as an eminent historian, joining Mary
first
in
book
that field.
As a sort of historian, yes.
Oh no, we'll see that the word eminent certainly applies. He's also team captain on Would I Lie to You on BBC One, I'm sure many of you know, host of The Unbelievable Truth on Radio 4, and one of The Observer's top columnists. So, thank you both very much indeed for coming in, and thank you all for being here. I should say, there will be a chance for you to ask questions at the end, so do store them up as we go along. And when we come to that, just put your hand up and we'll have some roving mics that will come your way. David, I'm going to start off by asking you, because I think this history double act that we have assembled was your idea.
Yes. I'm trying to get a bit of credibility for my tawdry comedian's attempt at a history book, and it's worked.
Yeah. Well, that was what I was going to ask. Isn't it just because you, as it turns out, like many other men, just think a great deal about the Roman Empire?
Yes, yeah. We,
And in skirts all the time, yomping over, conquering, building roads. That's your image, isn't it?
Absolutely. That's what men want to think about all the time. A straight road of conquest.
Yes.
Penetrating the enemy. So the enemy, both as foe and lover.
Yeah. And you know what? You do know what the Latin word for sword also means in Latin slang? Gladius. I don't need to tell you.
Was it, as in a swordsman, was an expression in English as well? Sword, penis, it's the same thing.
They borrowed it from Latin.
Right. Yeah, the Romans thought of everything including innuendo.
Everything first. They got everything.
I mean, Mary, you are obviously a very worthy exception to this rule. Why do you think that men think such a great deal about the Roman Empire?
Oh, I'm going to be terribly serious, I'm afraid. And I'm going to say, I think it's because it's a sort of safe space to be macho in. You can imagine yourself in those military skirts. You can imagine yourself building roads. And somehow it's all right because it's 2,000 years ago. You couldn't, nobody, look, I'm stretching things now, but nobody would say when asked, oh, how often do you think about the Third Reich? Well, 7 times a day. I mean, you'd be in jail, right?
Yeah.
Okay? But Rome is so far away, you can have that genocidal. You can channel your genocidal tendencies into something which is utterly safe. And my job here, I think, is to say, that's fine, guys. That is fine. Now let's make it a bit more interesting, because let's add back in, the women and the slaves and the people who weren't big white men in togas or military skirts.
So the Roman Empire is the acceptable face of fascism.
That's what the fascists thought, I have to say. And I think, yes. And we've just got to, I think it's in some ways it's great for someone like me because you've got something to fight against. You can deal with that. You can say yes, but think about this. And, off we go.
So, we're going to talk a lot about the themes that link the rulers in your books, and there are lots of similarities. But there's also a sort of historical overlap that you both reference. Mary, you talk about when Britain's invaded, and you describe it as the final frontier at the edge of the world, populated by strange people who dyed their skin blue, consumed milk and meat rather than bread, and dressed in animal hides.
Yes, that's Britain for you, as the Romans saw it. And it's, Britain, it's always a good thing to put in front of British jingoists, because Britain was the Romans' final frontier. It was their biggest error. It was a vanity project for the Emperor Claudius, who was desperate for a military victory. He actually got one, but it took the next 300 years, just to keep holding on to it. There were people in Rome who said, quite rightly, don't conquer Britain. It will be a drain on your resources. And they were absolutely right. But they did. And it's kind of given us a strange image of ourselves, I think. Are we British or are we Roman? I don't know.
As it allowed the British to feel like they were at the center of things because they were part of the Roman Empire, albeit a regrettable part that the Romans.
Yes, yeah.
Basically,
they did regret it. It was, it was damn stupid. It was like conquering Afghanistan, really, conquering Britain. As silly as that.
But when the Romans left, the legions left, the British were distraught. It seems.
Who says?
Well, I do. I've said it now. What I'm asserting now is that when the Romans left, every single person in Britain went, oh no, who's going to organize everything now?
Assert away.
Yeah.
That is in his book.
They were missed, the Romans.
But that just shows how far you, I'm surprised, how far you've assimilated that Roman view that what you need is a bit of organization. Yeah. Right?
Well, I do feel that.
In
so many ways.
You might feel that now,
Yeah.
but I think you might not have felt it in the 4th century CE. You might have thought, thank God they've gone. Right?
Well, do you think that's what the Romano-British felt as they buried their coins in hoards and let their villas go to crap?
I think that most of the people in Roman Britain probably wouldn't much have noticed that the Romans had been here, right?
Right.
So, they were living out on their little farms. They might have been using a few coins and but basically they were going on as they had before. They were still in the Iron Age. And if you say, well, basically, this does relate to your book, really. If you say, well, where does the Iron Age stop then? Well, some people think it stops about 1450, right? In Britain. Yeah. All your kings make no bloody difference.
Right.
So most of the peasants living like they've always done in little huts, either, probably nasty pieces of work, with the idea that they were all kind of Asterix kind of sweeties who had magic potion and kind of made tea or whatever. That's completely wrong. They were nasty shits. But they probably didn't notice the Romans. And they probably didn't notice Offa either.
Yeah. So when do you think people started noticing the government?
About 1970.
Actually,
It was a
That was
bad
when I
time.
did. That was when I did. You know, sorry, that's extremely self-obsessed view. I started noticing the government about 1970.
But that is what I wonder, writing about the Middle Ages, you wonder, and also throughout was life just carrying on in a miserable subsistence way, but we might as well focus on the people in the togas and the crowns because we know their names.
Yeah, you know, you've got Roman Empire, population of 50 million, you know, of which at best we know the names, even going down to the humblest tombstone of a couple of thousand. Most people, I mean, they certainly didn't know who the emperor was. There's a wonderful papyrus from Roman Egypt, written in a very, very educated, i.e. neat hand. And it's obviously some guy who's been sitting there in the 3rd century trying to write down a list of Roman emperors. You know, and some of them he's got right, most of them he's got wrong, right? And he's trying to work out, and he misses out Caligula. You know, is that because he thought Caligula was a shit, or because he'd forgotten about it? And length of reign, he's hopeless. And we kind of imagine that that somehow this mattered to most people. Well, it doesn't really. And when I'm giving talks about Roman emperors, and it kind of overlaps with your book, and I was interested to see that he's one of the few semi-heroes in Unruly. You know, I said, look, the Romans didn't know what emperor was what, any more than I know what century Edward III lived in, right? Well, you told me that he's quite important, and I've discovered this, so thank you very much. You won't think that Unruly is very funny, etc., but it gave me a few lessons about Edward III.
You learn a great deal in Unruly. You learn not just what David thinks of each of the kings in very fine.
I don't want to go into the rest of it, because some of it is so embarrassing.
David, do you think that's very different in terms of people's perception of their kings and queens in the time that you write about? People knew who they were.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the kings and the queens are they're the most important people, certainly in their own minds. But whether or not the majority of the population was aware of which Edward was on the throne is, I don't know. I haven't interviewed them.
Mary.
I was just trying to show you some emperors, because you can see that they all look the same. Right? There's some of mine. I mean, I think David's might look, your kings might look a bit different from my emperors. But look at that bottom row; they're all the same.
Yeah. What I will say, though, unlike the representations of many of the kings in my book, they do at least look like human beings. Because something happened to art at some point after the Roman Empire.
I'm afraid I'm going to say you're wrong now.
Really? Have you seen the drawing of Ethelred the Unready? I mean, I know he wasn't a good king.
I am sorry that we don't have a picture of Ethelred.
We should have Ethelred, but all I'm going to say to you, because I'm now going to turn into nasty little supervisor, Cambridge style, and I'm going to say the trouble is you have learned to think that images like that are human beings. You see? That has provided you the image of what the human ruler is.
Does this count towards my final grade?
It might.
Because if not,
if I'm marking it, it does.
I would say that those look like people, and the drawings in the Middle Ages of people like Ethelred look like they're Blue Peter competition winners in the under 6 category.
That just shows how brainwashed you've been,
Well, I tell you what.
These are white marble statues.
But that's the actual shape of someone's nose. They couldn't do noses. For like 1,000 years, they couldn't get their noses right.
Oh.
Okay,
I'm going to send him. He needs to go on an art history course. Your next book is going to be art history.
Well,
yes,
okay. Yeah.
But this is a sort of broader point about the blurring of fact and fiction in your books, which is very important. I mean, these are how they wanted to be portrayed. And you both talk a lot about this very murky place between fact and fiction that was something that rulers wanted to happen so that they could portray themselves in a mighty way.
They wanted, in a way, they needed these images. I'm not sure about Ethelred. He might be an exception. But they needed these images in order to believe in themselves as being powerful. We think this is all propaganda, and in part it is. You go down your street, not so much in the 11th century, but in the 2nd
Go down
century.
your rut.
Your rut,
Yeah.
right? But you go down your street, because Romans had streets, right? And you see these guys, and you think, and partly they're looking down on you, and you, as pleb, sort of, you get the point. What you forget is that these are, just like Offa and Co., these are frail, vulnerable, sometimes not very clever, uncertain human beings. And for reasons we now can't entirely understand, they have ended up as rulers of the Roman world. And they're shit scared. I think a lot of these are shit scared. And they need these images to say, I know that I am emperor, and looking like that means that I am in power.
That's very interesting, because I think in the Middle Ages, when obviously in the Roman emperors, as you say in your book, a lot of them are declared gods when they die. The relationship of the English kings in the Middle Ages with religion is different, but they are definitely endorsed by the divine. And the notion of coronation, of being anointed, that is of being born into a hereditary succession, that is saying, according to them and according to the establishment at the time, that they are supposed to be king. And that builds their confidence as much as the confidence of the rule.
It's the why am I here ruling question. And how do I know that I'm king or emperor, not just little me who's not very confident. And there are all kinds of different ways. We have them still, of learning to believe that you're different when you're not, when you actually know you're not.
Yes.
That's the problem of regal power.
What's interesting it seems to me that the medieval kings that totally believed that hype were among the worst. They're the ones that believed so unquestioningly, well, I must be king, I'm anointed and everything, so I must have a God-given right to rule and therefore a God-given aptitude to rule. Those are the ones that went off the rails, that undermined the institution of kingship the worst.
And eventually Charles I kind of implodes that.
Yeah, exactly.
And we kill him. We kill him for believing that.
And the way they struggle, they really don't want to kill a king. And they've killed several before Charles I. But Charles I...
They haven't killed as many as Roman emperors get killed, I have to say. By the way.
Where do you think this idea of the divine right, do you think it came from, this idea from Rome, that they were, when they died, they became gods? Or was it a very separate thing, the Anglo-Saxons, David, who this need, as you describe it, to outwardly assert a massive holy link between God, Christ, and some beardy guy with a sword?
Well, I mean, it's seen in the way, the tradition of coronation and anointing, that all comes from the Roman Empire, doesn't it? From the Byzantine Empire.
It comes from the eastern part of the Roman Empire. When we tend to say, the Roman Empire ended in the 5th century. No, it didn't. It did in the West. In the East, it went on till the middle of the 15th century. And they invented some of the institutions that filter back into your guys, actually. I mean, none of my emperors have a coronation, and they don't really wear a crown, and they don't have a throne. In the east of the empire, though, that kind of tradition does start, and you're kind of, your guys who are good at picking up trifles from other monarchies, they pick that up, and they use it brilliantly, actually.
Well, it's interesting that, because you say a lot of Roman emperors are assassinated by their troops, in the palace, or which really is rare among the medieval kings.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, but why? Yeah, why is that? Why are they able to? If it's so easy to kill them, how come the power of the emperor is so lasting?
I mean, it is very strange because what your book shows, I think, is that there are, and this would go for many early monarchies. They've got the same problem. Who's going to come next? How do you know who's going to come next? How do you prevent the family killing each other in order to put Joey on the throne rather than Simon? Right?
Yeah.
How do you do that? And they face the same problem, but your lot do appear to be less efficient at removing the opposition.
Very inefficient.
They are. My lot are quite efficient, actually.
And also more efficient at deciding, certainly for periods, at deciding a successor that there might be some actual support for and might have a level of competence that would allow them to govern through the being adopted. And if you can adopt your successor, then you have a wider range of people to choose from.
Yeah. The Romans in the 2nd century, it's when Gibbon said his most famous, but in some ways most stupid remark, that in the Roman rulers of the 2nd century made it the world that was the best place ever to have existed on the whole of the planet, ever. Now, that cannot possibly have been true.
Yeah. Well, he didn't know about Netflix.
So. He didn't know about China, right? Netflix. I forgive him not knowing about Netflix. But what happens in Rome is that moment of succession, which you bring out in your book as being always necessarily fraught. The Romans, even with adoption, never quite manage to solve it. They never get a seamless transition between one of these blokes and the next. And, in some ways that's good because as you say, there's something awful about primogeniture. The idea that the eldest son or the eldest child becomes the next ruling monarch, because you have to put up with however hopeless they might be.
Yeah.
They might be completely unsuitable. But if you don't have primogeniture, you have a fight.
Yeah.
And your guys do seem to manage the fight a bit better.
It's certainty versus competence.
Yes.
Which do you want most? Do you want the best person to rule or a better person to rule? Or you just want to know, and maybe it'll be an idiot, but at least we're all agreed.
I don't mind, we don't mind an idiot as long as we don't have a period when we're all sticking knives in each other's back.
Yes.
Better the idiot than backstabbing.
Is that right? Yeah. Have you both decided that? Because you both sort of seem unsure. David, you say it doesn't seem very fair that someone could be a king just because of who his dad was, and yet if that system is in place, it's a lot less, to use your word, wobbly.
Yeah.
And Mary, as you say, they had no fixed rule, and that created a cult of suspicion and a lot of death.
I don't think either of us actually like monarchy much, though, do we?
No.
So to ask us what's the better way of making monarchy kind of succeed is a slightly odd question.
Well, the thing is...
David likes monarchy, don't you?
He says he doesn't.
No, I don't.
In the book, he says explicitly he doesn't.
I don't like the autocratic monarchy of the Middle Ages. I don't think that countries should be ruled by someone who is born to power. I think it's absurd, and the people who end up ruling then is daft. I don't mind constitutional monarchy because I don't back this country currently to reform its own constitution in a way that wouldn't make things worse. And I think it's an acceptable fudge, and we have some harmless people in gilded cages, and that's fine by me. But I don't think they should have real power.
No. Yeah. That is, I think, that's probably true. I think that you do feel torn between feeling deeply sorry for them and thinking, look, you've got everything, shut up, basically. I just don't. I don't know. I think what you're saying is what I think. That of all my political priorities, abolishing the monarchy in this country is not top of the list.
Yeah. Yes. quite. But I have sympathy for, and one of the things that's nice about looking at periods like the Roman Empire or the Middle Ages is you do realize that things are in many ways better now, and we have the possibility to have a disputed succession in government without a civil war, and that's great. But it's really difficult to put that in place.
Well, you could also resign. I mean, one of the problems about the Roman Empire and your kings is you couldn't resign. Now, at least Liz Truss resigned.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
You know? And so that's something we can be thankful for.
Yeah. Well, there is no doubt, for example, that Henry VI, one of our most useless kings, but not an unpleasant man as far as we can tell, would have loved to resign on hundreds of occasions. But he was the king, and there was nothing he could do about it.
Yeah, but the Romans did in the end invent abdication. It took them 3 centuries.
Right.
But by the end of the 3rd century, they'd invented abdication, which changed things a bit.
Yeah.
Yes,
but
I
not
suppose
much.
kings had a little bit more of a get out in the terms that they could leave.
Well, in what sense could
they could abdicate. They could.
Well, none of them
They never did.
abdicated. No, they weren't able to abdicate. They would be killed because it wasn't safe to have a rightful king alive when someone else was trying to rule. And so all the times when they made Edward II abdicate, and Edward III became king, but he didn't last long. He was not killed with a red-hot poker up his backside, but he was murdered because just having someone that is a more rightful king alive at the same time is just not safe.
Well, it's like the 2 popes, isn't it, a bit?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
very cool.
You know,
but
it's
actually, your emperors also die in all sorts of weird ways, like pokers up backsides and sort of similar things. Another similarity between...
They're assassinated in compromising positions. But Caracalla was assassinated while he was having a pee on campaign. He'd gone behind a bush to have a slash and was killed.
But is that...
You think it's, now it seems quite funny. I'm sure it wasn't at the time.
But the thing about that is, one of the things I've loved in your book is how you make it clear that the reputations of the emperors for being good or bad are not things we can be certain about at all, but are largely determined by whether or not the next emperor gained by exalting his predecessor or by denigrating him.
Yeah.
So
it's exactly Richard III and Henry VII, isn't it?
So the guy that got killed while having a pee, that obviously he seems like a loser, doesn't he?
Yes.
Going for a pee, can't even have a wee without getting killed. He can't rule the Roman Empire. And so it may be that that's not true. That
It could be that it's not true.
Because his successor, who said, I'd be much better being emperor, I can have a pee whenever I like and nobody ever kills me.
No, I wish I should have said that in the book, actually. I think it's spot on. But there is a basic rule, and I think it applies to English kings too, which is that if you are assassinated, you will have a very, very bad reputation. Now, that could logically be because you were assassinated, because you were a bad guy. That's not impossible. I mean, I'm not sure whether Caligula was nice, but I don't think so, probably. But it's equally true that if you're assassinated, the investment of the next ruler to just dump on you is so big, that actually you have become a villain because you were assassinated. Yeah. And you can never, ever escape from that.
Because they need the legitimacy to have replaced the assassinate. And they also need to say, assassinating emperors isn't something you just do at the drop of a hat.
It's only because they're bad.
Yeah, they have to be,
they're very, very bad.
Really, they have to be this dreadful.
Yes.
So you might think, I'm not perfect, but you don't want to assassinate me. It doesn't warrant
That's
it.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
And you also, the assassins have to look, the next regime has to look kind of absolutely look no hands. So we've got that story after the assassination of Caligula of Claudius, dear old Claudius, made lovely by Robert Graves and Derek Jacobi, probably more by Jacobi actually than Graves, I think, but Then he was, after the assassination of Caligula, he was just found behind a curtain, right? Minding his own business, a bit terrified, and the Praetorian Guard just said, I think we've got our new emperor here. And we believe that story.
Yes.
It's absolutely barking, I'm afraid.
But yes, it doesn't make any sense. No.
The only sense you can make of it is that Claudius plotted the assassination of Caligula and then said, not me, Gov. I was just fine behind a curtain, right? Hiding, because I was so scared.
These labels of good and bad and the sort of reputations that have been handed down to us are things that both of you seem to be wanting to reevaluate. I mean, Mary, you say emperors did not fall into such simple categories any more than modern monarchs, presidents, or prime ministers do. No ruler pleases everyone. Good in whose opinion, we should always ask, and bad by what criteria? But were there any particular emperors that you think have had pretty bad press that shouldn't have?
Well, I think the problem about that is I can tell you the emperors have had bad press, but whether they should or should not have had it, I think is much more problematic. But let me just show you a picture. Come on, this is the last. Can I get one? How do I make this work? Have we changed? No, we haven't. Oh, shit. Oh, well.
There's...
Right, here we are. If you want to explore what a bad emperor looks like, I suggest you forget Nero, you forget Caligula, and you go to the 3rd century Emperor Elagabalus, who was a teenager. He was on the throne for 4 years. He had 4 wives in that period. He was a Syrian, and he encapsulates for Roman writers absolutely everything that is bad. So if you want to get the template of the bad emperor, you go to him. And here you have a 19th century version of one of his crimes. Elagabalus invented the whoopee cushion, amongst other things. But this is not showing the whoopee cushion. This is showing one of his dinner parties. He's reclining at the back, in which he was so generous to his guests that he showered them with rose petals in such profusion that they smothered and died. And Alma Tadema here is capturing that sad and tragic and slightly pathetic scene. What I think, what David reaches to sometimes, and what I try to do in my book, is to say, okay, we don't necessarily believe this. Come on, guys, is this true or not? How do we know? But it tells you, that kind of anecdote tells you something important about power. It tells you something important about the monarch. And here, it is telling us, you have to watch kings, because when they're being generous to you, they can kill you. And, there is the generosity of the monarch can never actually be straightforwardly generous. You have to be frightened of the king. You have to be frightened when they're nice to you.
Yes.
And I think that Elagabalus and the rose petals, one of the great kind of homicides of history in a way, but it captures important points about the fear of the emperor.
Well, it seems like it's saying, look at what can happen with power and how it can corrupt someone and turn someone mad, and so we have to be fearful of these people that have power. And the Tudors want you to think that about Richard III. Doesn't happen so much in the medieval period because of this notion of primogeniture and anointing, and almost all of the kings are therefore, according to the system that everyone is going along with, they were supposed to be king, and so there's quite a low ceiling on the extent to which you can say they were dreadful. And you can say it about Richard III if you're a Tudor, but you can't totally say it about Richard II, however bad he is, because there's no doubt he was supposed to be king. He was the lawful, by primogeniture, by anointing, he was the next Plantagenet. And so the fact that he is then awful at being king and turns into a tyrant is really, people don't really know what to do about it. And so they put him in a castle, and they think, we can't kill him. So they don't do anything, and he starves to death, which is I mean, that is...
Better than that.
Yeah.
Better than dying by rose petals.
Probably. Just, I was really looking forward to this dinner, and now I'm being crushed by petals. So they can't slag them up. And even King John, who really is a bad king, I mean, most of them are quite bad, really, but in general, I would say the reputations for badness are more historically accurate than the reputations for greatness. But King John, all of the kings afterwards are descended from him. So you're not allowed to say he shouldn't have been king, or Henry III shouldn't have been king, and Edward I shouldn't have been king, etc., etc., etc.
Well, that's the problem with Julius Caesar and the assassination. Julius Caesar is the origin of Roman autocratic imperial monarchy. He was assassinated, but somehow what you have to do ever after is somehow to incorporate him, just like your guys, into a story of the history of monarchy. And they're very imaginative about doing it. Actually, it's there's a lot of intellectual energy goes into this, isn't it?
Yeah.
You talk about sort of, death by rose petals. You've talked about pretty horrible stories. A lot of the stories are, Mary, you described the Colosseum as ghastly. How are we to judge these rulers? By our own standards? Because as you say, Mary, none of them are good or nice by our standards.
Well, that's the problem of history, isn't it? There's two sides in a rather silly binary debate, which is, on the one hand, you have to take history in its own terms, right? And you can't judge them by our standards. Well, sorry, I do want to judge the Colosseum by our standards. I want to say it's brutal and murderous. The other side is, well, I'm allowed to kind of impose my own moral view on the Romans or, whatever one of these medieval monarchs are like, and say they're all shit. Well, the study of history is, I hope, is supposed to help you kind of see why you have to play those two things off against one another. That, you do have to think about what they thought about it, but you can't lose your own moral compass.
Yeah.
And, I think a lot of the sort of historical outrage that you see on Twitter, if you say, well, I think Caesar committed genocide in Gaul, he did. What are you doing, you so-called Professor Beard, saying that, judging Caesar by your own standards? Well, they are my standards, and I'm happy to judge anybody by my own standards, but I'm also going to be a better historian if I try to think what their standards were. And I think that's the tightrope you walk. They're both barking mad, horrible, and also they're people we should take seriously.
But I think the starting point has to be that people are basically the same. So if you, and I mean that they do precisely the same things for all of their life. No,
well, they piss, but make love.
Yeah, exactly. They piss, they make love, they eat. So that if you have a context in which everyone's behaviour is, by our standards, incomprehensibly dreadful, that's learning about the context. And you can't then take it. What Caesar did in Gaul is obviously was extreme by the standards of the day, but not as extreme a thing to do then as it would have been now. And by working that out, that's how the understanding of the past starts to emerge. And that's the only way you can take any kind of meaningful lesson from the past, is to say if you have a totally different context, then people who would otherwise be reasonable will start committing genocide.
And it is what the past is good for, actually, in terms of thinking about yourself. It's not about lessons, but what the past in that kind of way enables you to do is to think about what it would be like not to think like me.
Yes.
Or what we would be like if we didn't think like we do. And it's that thought experiment which I think is so important in thinking about the past, not either finger wagging and saying, excuse me, this was built by exploited labour or whatever. I once said I thought we should go round all the objects in the British Museum and put a kind of a little cross on every object that was made by a slave. And we would find most of the objects had crosses on them. Now, that's important to look at that. It's also important to think about how it might be to have thought about that sort of production differently.
Actually, David, I suppose in your book, you do relate quite, specifically to some of them and their ways. You have great sympathy, empathy, you call it, with some of them, particularly 1066. Very invested, in fact, in poor old Harold.
Well, what's interesting about Harold there is that Harold is the last king of a regime that is absolutely and undoubtedly overthrown, and that the current name above the letterhead of this country is William the Conqueror's successors. That's when we fundamentally changed management, and every management since then has cited the fact that they are descended from William the Conqueror. So that's a real breaking point. And Harold was related to no one. He wasn't royal at all. He was just
a loser, total loser.
So considering that, he gets a remarkably good press. Because you'd think he would be absolutely a sitting duck for, he died doing a poo.
No, that's not true. It's the Bayer tapestry and it's the arrow in the eye.
Yeah.
That's what you think, oh my God, that's what it's like, arrow in the eye. And every little boy, I'm not sure about little girls, but every little boy, somehow, as you say in the book, kind of, they're on Team Harold.
Yeah.
They really are.
It's William the Conqueror's only major failure. That he didn't make Harold seem unsympathetic.
That's right. Oh, that's right. That's absolutely right.
What about the way in which, for both of you, writing about these rulers made you think about more modern-day rulers? Because, Mary, you say at the end of the book, it sort of thinking hard over the past years about autocracy as fundamentally a fake sham, distorting mirror, has helped you understand the Roman political culture, of course, but also opened your eyes to the politics of the modern world. And David, I know you sort of used looking at these rulers to sort of figure out a sense of, identity or to understand who we are. Mary, how did it help you think of modern-day rulers in comparison?
In all kinds of ways, but I think that one of the themes that I saw came out over the course of writing the book was the idea of whether the ruler is anything ever other than an actor. Are they always pretending? And that comes out, I think, very vividly in Roman anecdotes, particularly about the Emperor Nero, who's a terribly keen professional, semi-professional actor. And there's loads and loads of stories about him. He shows up in the theatre and he's so keen that everybody should watch the show that he's presenting till the very end, that he locks the doors, doesn't let them out, so that, women give birth in the theatre. Some old guys are canny, and they pretend to die so they can get carried out, right?
That's so much death.
And it's, there's a lot of death in the ancient world. And part of the point of that is that Nero's crazy. Nero, doesn't know when to stop. Nero's passion for being an actor is, it's taken to ridiculous extremes, and that's true. I think it's also a question of saying, what do we imagine it's like if our rulers are just actors? Right? And I thought about that in relation to two recent events, one charming and one less charming, I think. One was the famous Rishi Sunak moment when he, in order to show that we were all in it together with fuel price rises, when he was pictured filling up a car he clearly did not drive, with a petrol pump he didn't know how to work, and a credit card he didn't quite know how to pay at, and the press instantly, they made him the Nero. What he's doing is he's just pretending. The nicer side of that, however, was the late Queen And there was an interview recently with the guy who had produced the Paddington Bear video. And he said that at the end of the video, he said to the Queen, he said, "Mum, you really are a very good actor." And she had replied, "Are you surprised? It's all that I do," right? And I thought, actually, the old biddy had got it.
Yeah.
You know, she'd got the point that actually the boundaries between acting, pretense, performance, and ruling were very, very fuzzy.
I think that's very interesting when you think of, I mean, just the other day, there was a picture of Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt at a Nissan factory where there's some deal on electric cars or whatever, but they're at this Nissan factory. It's not where they work, quite a long way. So they've both gone there.
They've got jackets on,
on a busy day. I mean, I feel quite busy all the time. Somebody said to me, "No, you've got to head up to the northeast to have a photo taken in a Nissan factory." I go, "Well, that's fucked my week," you know. But apparently, despite it being the week of the autumn statement, Jeremy Hunt was able to make time, and despite being Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak was able to make time. And there's a picture of them there in front of a Nissan, grinning, and I think Rishi Sunak's vaguely sticking the Nissan label on, is the idea. You sort of think, what is the point of that? And you're doing that, you're deliberately doing that at the same time as trying to presumably maintain the illusion that you're running the country. And is it what, a part-time job, 10 till 12 in the morning, run the country, and then it's photos? And so who does run the country? You know.
Well, that is the Nero problem. And I think when we see Rishi, we always ought to say he has got the Nero problem.
Yeah.
Right?
What
but he can't play a musical instrument.
No.
So, you know, what's he going to do when London burns?
And Rome is happily not burning right now.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, in terms of writing about your kings and queens, though, how did that make you reflect on it? Do you feel more lucky that we have the rulers that we do compared to the sort of Ethelred the Unready and...
Well, I think I went into it not imagining that a return to medieval kingship would be a good move in terms of the constitution. So, but what I find interesting is that I think in Britain there is the cultural identity of all the sections of Britain that aren't England are quite strong and well defined, and the cultural identity of England is quite wishy-washy. And a lot of people, so I know what it means to be in London, to be a Londoner, to be from Cornwall, to be from Yorkshire, to be from Kent. But what does it mean to be English? And I don't think there's much of an answer other than, well, we've got that heritage, that past. That's what we are. We're the people who came out of that past. And the key part of our past is our kings and queens that wore the crowns that are still on everything. And so I sort of feel the story of our kings is sort of vital to England's sense of identity. It's sort of the first thing we point to. And so looking at that is interesting because the story is daft. It's full of failure and disappointment, and it's colourful, but it's absurd.
But the absurdity is also really meaningful. You know, the absurdity is teaching us what we are.
Yes.
You know? Yeah. And we can back other sides. We can be the peasants in the Peasants' Revolt. I think what's great about the book, your book, I mean, is that, there is this spine of kingship, which I kind of deplore, and I think they're probably mostly awful. But it's a spine that makes other things mean things, and it makes... You can see what it is to be opposed to that. I don't think you have to kind of buy into kingship to find it useful. You can actually think these guys are a load of appalling villains, and we hate them, but somehow they're still there for us.
Yes.
And we can do with them what we want, honestly. I mean, I think the great thing about history is we own it, they don't.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think there is a sort of duty on the historian to have some kind of degree of responsibility in how they tell those people's stories. But in the end, it's we're the people who are doing the telling, and we're deciding what it means. And you say this in the book, and I think that's absolutely right. History is ours. It's not theirs. I'm afraid they're dead. You know? They are long dead. The Romans are dead. All those macho men tramping over genocidally, you know, the virgin fields of Western Europe, they're dead, right?
Hey, I need to go to audience questions.
In a way, the history is these were the great people, and they were the problem. And the story of humanity is how we coped with those problem people.
Yes.
And definitely English history, all of the institutions of the medieval England and the things that are most interesting were coping strategies for dealing with kings.
And we get back at them, and this is very quick, Hannah, don't worry. One of the stories I best remember where the Roman emperor is horribly shown up is when the Emperor Hadrian, it's an appalling bit of violence, he gets cross with a slave, he takes his stylus out, his pen, and he throws the pen, he gouges the slave's eye out. And it's, it's one of the worst bits of slave exploitation. Hadrian then, of course, feels very bad about this. Think, oh shit, what have I done? And so he brings the slave back in and said, I'll give you anything. Just say what you want. I will give you anything. And the slave just replies, I'd like my eye back, please.
It is the worst story in the book of very bad stories.
Yeah.
I feel like I cannot go to audience questions without mentioning the women. It's very important to me. And on the one hand, you say it's our history, but one of the things sort of glaringly missing is the opinions, the recollections, the memoirs of any women. Mary, you say that Nero's mother's autobiography, Agrippina, is one of the greatest losses to all of classical literature.
It is, yes.
But on a positive note, you also do say that this was a time when women became more seen, they had more of a presence and more of an influence than they'd had.
Some women did, a few women did, and I think that's true. I think, however, Roman history, like quite a lot of medieval history, is a time when women come into prominence in order to be blamed for the men messing up, really. And it's easier to blame the woman than to blame the bloke. Carrie Johnson, I don't think she's here tonight, but if she were, she'd know what I meant.
Do you think that's the case? You also say about women, one of the boring things about a lot of history is the towering sexism of the ages and many subsequent ages, which has left the specifics of all the brilliant or shitty things women were doing unrecorded, and you'd basically think, from all the research you did, they were essentially just marrying kings.
Well, yes, there's certainly, I think, in the medieval England, there wasn't quite the tradition of saying that of talking about the scheming woman behind the throne. It happened, but not to the extent. It's a big deal in Rome. Anything that went wrong, she probably poisoned him.
Yeah.
It was probably, and it is more just they just married that, and they don't. The women's the reality even of powerful, rich women's lives isn't just. We don't know as much about it. It isn't much discussed. There are a few exceptions, like the civil war between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda.
Matilda, she's all right, isn't she?
And absolutely. She doesn't allow herself to be forgotten by history.
No, she doesn't take no shit.
Yeah,
no.
she doesn't.
Very quick, who Matilda is.
Matilda was the son of...
It doesn't matter who she is, really.
The main thing is, she was very horrible to a man called Stephen.
Yeah.
No,
that is the main thing.
But no, she was defrauded of her inheritance, and she didn't take it lying down. But nevertheless, it was a very sexist time, and King Stephen remained just about on the throne until he died, despite her efforts. But her efforts were considerable. The main consequence was it's two posh people having a war and
they're
making...
all posh people,
yeah,
aren't they?
exactly.
They're all posh people.
Yeah,
Do you think it would have been different if there had been more women ruling over those times?
probably
No.
No. Mary, I've consulted Professor Mary Beard. She said no. But it's such a huge if. You don't make that one change. That's a completely different attitude to humanity, isn't it?
You end with a...
That's absolutely true, David. Absolutely true.
Why did you choose to end where you did with a very notable woman, Elizabeth I?
Well, because I thought the book needed to be about something coherent. I thought it needed to be not too long. And I thought, if I go beyond Elizabeth I, it's
Where do I stop?
Yeah, and there's no reason to stop before...
Elizabeth II.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then the book is far too long. And also, then it raises the question, why did you ignore Scotland up to 1603 and only start paying it any attention when the kings of England are also kings of Scotland?
You'd have got trashed in the Scottish Herald if you'd done that.
Exactly. And I live in fear of the Scottish Herald editorial page.
Well, who doesn't? Well, I'm very glad that both of you started and ended where you did. We haven't managed to get through nearly enough of all of it, but as I said, people can buy both the books and have them signed afterwards, and all the other questions, the many other questions, will be answered within. But please raise your hands very high if you have a question. And also, please make sure you say it very succinctly but loudly, because we might have some trouble hearing from the stage, even if everyone in the auditorium will. Can you bring the lights down a tiny bit, because I can't see people's faces. There's a hand there.
See anybody.
Up, I mean. Thank you. And, Perfect.
Yeah, thank you very much. I always imagined Charles I saying A to Cromwell. What was your favourite act of either self-harm or debauchery of kings, queens, emperors, etc.?
Could you hear that? Favourite act of self-harm or debauchery?
Or committed by a Roman
Committed
emperor
by,
or an
let's
English
go first. Well, who wants to go first?
Favourite?
Oh, God.
It's an odd thing to have a favourite thing off, but...
I don't know. I'm not so sure.
Something that springs to mind was something that Ethelred the Unready did, which is was not a good thing at all, but it really puts the tin lid on him being, a regrettable figure to have held power, because he was very, very weak, very panicking about the Vikings all the time, trying to pay off the Vikings whenever they came, which basically just turned himself into a cash point for the Vikings. But then he turned a little bit spiteful one day and ordered that anyone Danish in the whole of England be murdered. So it's like you're thinking, oh, poor guy, he's so weak, he doesn't know what to do. But then just on a bad day, he turned suddenly genocidal.
So it's said.
Yeah, so it's said. We don't know if he actually did that.
No, we don't. I think that, many people's favourite anecdote, but I'm not going to say it out loud, I'm going to suggest you Google it, really, is what Tiberius did in the swimming pool with small boys, right? But you put Tiberius swimming pool into Google, it will come up instantly.
So you're referring your answer to Google or a second?
I think that, Elagabalus, who's still on the screen, I think, is, he's the source of most of these. He was said never to have worn the same pair of shoes twice. And that always kind of appealed to me, because that's just Imelda Marcos territory. Imelda Marcos was supposed to have, after her death, been found with cupboards full of 3,000 pairs of shoes. Now, nobody ever actually counted or discovered these shoes. But it's the same story as Elagabalus. It's exactly the same story. Shoes and monarchs is something terribly important, isn't it? Do you kiss the shoes of the monarch? Does the monarch wreck the precious shoes by walking on them? Or does he say, after he's worn them once, never again?
I would say it would be positively annoying to have a system where you're not allowed to wear the same pair of shoes twice. You'd sort of go, now I'm on this system where I'm such a big shot, I can't wear the same shoes twice.
Well, that's
so
right.
I liked yesterday's shoes, but now I've got to break in today's shoes.
And it's only, I haven't got time to break them in because I've only got a day, right? But it's like Kate, isn't it? It's like Princess Catherine. Yeah. As soon as she goes out in the same outfit twice, she's either applauded for, using it again, or ridiculed. Because,
depending which paper.
Hasn't she worn that before? And so I think that is the imperial and royal
But it shows a lack of, it's the lack of imagination about the truth of the mega power of the Roman emperor, potentially.
Yeah, no,
They're reducing it to the level of shoes.
No, but you see, I don't think it's lack of imagination. I think that is how you understand the power of these people. You know, you don't understand it in big terms because we can't conceptualize that. So we actually focus on their shoes, what they eat, all those things that we can understand, and we can say, well, what would I do if I was Roman emperor? If I could sleep with anybody in the whole world, who would it be, right? And that's what these stories are asking themselves. They're kind of trying to get imperial or monarchical power down to something that we can begin to sort of grasp in our own terms. So I think shoes are in many ways the key to imperial power.
Actually, food is really interesting. I mean, you say they're more tapas types, the Roman emperors, than meat and two veg.
Yes, I don't believe all these stories about vast banquets. I mean, there was a bit of display food there, but think of the poor buggers. They're lying down to eat.
Yes.
That's going to give them awful acid reflux for a start, I think. But they're balanced on one arm. They've only got one hand because they've got the glass in the other, and they haven't got a fork because forks haven't been invented yet. So they can eat finger food.
Yeah.
They can't eat, a whole roast boar unless it's been cut up.
Were you disappointed by this, David?
Well, no, but I've often thought that reclining, because the elbow you're propped up on is just going to get tremendously achy.
And then I'm
going to swap sides again.
Yeah, and your hand goes numb, and you drop your glass, and then the other one has to. Well, it can't carve half a side of boar.
Yes, it looks great for a photo shoot, but it's not. It's no way to have a big meal. You bring in one of Henry VIII's feasts there.
Yeah, that's really. Now you're talking.
Yeah.
But in some Roman dinners, they put the couches around a little pool, and in order to get the food to the diners, they put it in little boats, and they pushed it across to the diners, who, with their one free hand, would have tried to kind of grind, like some terrible fairground amusement.
You have to move on to another
disappointment as a vol au vent plops into the water.
Right. Can you get your supper? Oh God, the roast dormouse is now in the bottom of the pond.
These are the brilliant levels of detail that in both books you get. A
Absolutely,
serious
really
insight into living at these times.
Gritty reality.
Yes, over there, and then can you put your hand? Who can we come to next?
So I was going to ask, I don't know to what extent you've been able to compare notes about your two processes ahead of writing the two books, but I thought about the two different time periods and the access to primary sources. Obviously, the Roman period is very, very different to the written period that you experienced, David. So to what extent would access to primary source material impact the extent to which you can actually say that the story that you're telling is a true reflection of the story that you're actually writing?
Well, I didn't go to any primary source.
David, your mark has just gone down a notch. You could have disguised it.
Yeah, well, I looked at the picture of Ethelred the Unready and at the Alfred Jewel, from which I inferred that people back then couldn't draw.
You'd seen that before.
Yes, I had seen that before. Yeah, well,
You
I was
say you'd
already
seen it
on top of a lot of the primary sources before, as Mary says. But no, my book is an overview, and I read lots of other books about the English kings, but I didn't go and dig under a castle wall to see, oh, hang on, they had mobile phones.
You read Bede. You read Bede's Ecclesiastical.
That's a primary source.
I did read Bede.
So that we didn't have to.
Is it a primary source? She's writing about hundreds of years earlier. It's already a secondary source, and it's a shit one at that.
Oh, that is a really irritating student remark, isn't it? Oh, no, think Bede's a primary source, you stupid old professor.
I don't know.
Yours. Bede, he's just awful. He's not very good.
I did read Bede when I was 19, and it was boring. But I know Bede is important, and we owe Bede a lot, and I've come round to Bede.
You've got your sorry schoolboy pose.
I do think it's important to be able to say that some of these people are boring.
Yeah.
I do think that is important. But I'm going to be the prof now, and I'm going to say, look, what I wanted to do was to say, stuff all this kind of complaints that people like me usually bring out, that there is so little primary source material for the Roman Empire. Isn't that awful? We don't have the voice of women, etc. Very kind of moany sort of historical stuff. I wanted to say, look, we've got more about the Roman Emperor and the Roman Empire than we could ever read, anybody could ever read in a lifetime. And actually, it is as rich as any period up to the Renaissance. And the problem is that mostly, I'm afraid to say, that professional historians tend to keep to themselves the best bits, frankly. And what I wanted to do in the book, in part, was to say, look, let's share some of the best bits. And, one of my favorite little vignettes was a guy in the 3rd century who's in the province of Roman Egypt who who hasn't had his moment in the spotlight. But what we have is basically his emails, or they would now be his emails, that he's sending up and down the food chain because he's trying to organize a royal visit. And just like organizing a royal visit now, it's bloody hard work, and most of the people are dead uncooperative. So you get these, as it were, emails sent off to the people just down the food chain, where he's saying, now you've got to get the bakery ready because there's going to be a lot of hungry soldiers, and what are we doing about it? The answer comes back, well, why should we get the bakery ready? Isn't that somebody else's job? Meanwhile, he's writing to the person above him saying, I'm trying to get these people to do all, to get this right. It's not my fault. I'm terribly sorry. And suddenly you're in the world of a middle manager that you can kind of understand. And no one's ever said that we have access to them in the Roman Empire, but we do all over the place.
I mean, you have similarly extraordinary detail about one of the trips abroad of Becket.
Yes.
Where did that come from?
I can't remember where that came from, but it was...
Because he doesn't read primary stuff.
Tell us a little bit before we get to
when Thomas everyone calls him Thomas à Becket for no good reason. But except it's sort of got a rhythm.
What
to
is
it.
he? Thomas
Becket.
Becket.
The Becket was put in to make him
Scan.
That's why I said Becket, because I was getting confused.
I think to maybe make him seem a bit Catholic at a time later when being Catholic. I mean, he was Catholic, but not at a time when he could have been Protestant. Well, he would have been very fashion forward if he'd gone Protestant. But before he was Archbishop of Canterbury, he was the Chancellor of England. He was Henry II's first minister, and he had to go to Paris to arrange the marriage of a toddler to a toddler. And he went in great state, and he had like loads of gold plates and a whole coach full of monkeys dressed in suits, and basically he was a bit of a noob. He wasn't as posh as all the aristocrats he was meeting. He was literate, so he was in the very, very top section of society, but at the bottom part of the section we ever hear about. So he'd done well, and he really went for it with his display and with his outfits, and he basically travelled around like a rap star, and it's funny. But then he was made Archbishop of Canterbury, a job he didn't ask for, and he went really serious.
You do.
Yeah.
I want to just add 10 seconds worth of really important information that you can find in my book, which is the first known Western reference to an anal suppository, which was actually shoved up the bum of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius at the end of the 2nd century by the by the elite and celebrity kind of Dr. Michael Mosley sort of character in the ancient world, the Dr. Galen. He cured Marcus Aurelius of his gummed up tummy by a very, very expensive anal suppository. Now, nobody ever tells you that we have that kind of information.
No, Dr. Mosley is a very important source of information.
Dr. Mosley is.
Galen.
Presumably that's because Marcus Aurelius was a successful, deemed a good emperor, and his heir was, his adopted son ruled after him. And so the stories about things that happened to his bum weren't, I mean, if he'd been assassinated, they'd be full of, do you know what he used to do? All the time, he'd get doctors to stick things up his bum.
I have to say...
I'm going to take one last question.
I have to say that Galen is boasting about putting his finger in his suppository.
I knew the Mary and David show was going to be a difficult one to bring to an end. Just one last question. Is there a microphone? Do you want to come forward?
Someone's got a mic there.
He's got his mic there.
We're ready.
Okay.
Am I okay to go first?
You've got the mic.
Thank you very much. I want to ask, what inspired you to talk about rulers now, during your careers? What inspired you now to write about them?
What inspired them to talk about rulers at this stage in their career?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, God. It is a bit of a middle-aged thing to do, isn't it? I think. I suppose I just lived with these guys for such a long time, and I taught them, and I wondered about them, and I thought, right, I'm going to face up to you now. So I was, in a way, I think, David's much younger than me, and less kind of perhaps involved with his kings, but I'm settling scores when I'm talking about these Roman emperors. They've lived with me for the last 50 years, and I'm now having my say about them, I think.
Well, for me, it was during COVID, and I started to type about the Vikings, because it struck me that the Vikings were like COVID, in that there was something shit that suddenly happened to everyone. That's not from the Vikings' point of view. I'm showing a want of empathy for the Vikings there by aligning them with a virus. But from the point of view of the people in England, the Vikings just turned up, the world turned on its head and went dreadful when these Viking ships started arriving. And that's how it felt when COVID struck. And there were a lot of things that we could have prepared better, we could have done that. But basically, it was something dreadful out of the blue, like the Vikings.
Most people didn't think COVID was like the Vikings, though. That's,
Well, they need to read my book, and they'll find out why it was.
It's a bit of a niche comparison.
I'm genuinely sorry that people may have trains to catch. Otherwise, I could quite happily sit and talk to you both about emperors and kings and queens and all the awful things they got up to for another hour. But you're both going to be signing your books outside, aren't you, for a while?
Yes.
So you can get your copies signed up there. Thank you, David and Mary, very, very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Quite funny.
Just
It's much more fun than some of the things I do.